Although it may not warrant an eminent place in the annals of literary mystery, the curious case of Alvaro Rouselott is worthy of attention, for a few minutes at least. Keen readers of mid-20th century Argentine literature, who do exist albeit not in great numbers, will no doubt remember that Rousselot was a skilled narrator and an abundant inventor of plots, a sound stylist in literary Spanish, but not averse to the use of Buenos Aires slang, or lunfardo, when a story required it, as often was the case, though never in a mannered way, at least in our opinion, that is the opinion of his faithful readers. But the action of that sinister and eminently sardonic character, Time, has prompted reconsideration of Rousselot's apparent simplicity. Perhaps he was complicated, by which I mean more complicated than we had imagined, or there is an alternative explanation. Perhaps he was simply another victim of chance. Such cases are not unusual among lovers of literature, like Rousselot. In fact, they are not unusual among lovers of anything. In the end, we all outlast the object of our adoration, perhaps because passion runs its course more swiftly than other human emotions, perhaps as a result of excessive familiarity with the object of desire. In any case, Rousselot loved literature as much as any Argentine writer of his generation or of the preceding and following generations, which is to say that he loved literature in a reasonably disillusioned manner, like many of his compatriots. What I mean to say is that he was not especially different from the others, from the peers who shared his moments of joy and his suffering, yet nothing even remotely similar happened to any of them. At this point, it could be objected quite reasonably that the others were destined for their own hells, their own singularities. Angela Caputo, for example, killed herself in an unimaginable manner. No one who had read her poems with their charged and ambivalently childlike atmosphere could have predicted such an atrocious death, stage managed down to the finest detail for maximum terrifying effect. Or Sanchez Brady, whose texts were hermetic and whose life was cut short by the military regime in the 70s, when he had passed the age of 50 and lost interest in literature, and in the world in general. Paradoxical deaths and destinies, yet they do not eclipse the case of Rousselot, of the enigma that imperceptibly enveloped his life, the sense that his work, his writing, stood near or on the edge of something he knew almost nothing about. His story can be recounted simply, perhaps because, in the final analysis, it is a simple story. In 1950, at the age of 30, Rousselot published his first book, a novel about daily life in a remote Patagonian penitentiary, under the rather laconic title Solitude. Naturally, the book relates numerous confessions about past lives and fleeting moments of happiness. It also relates numerous acts of violence. Halfway through the novel, it becomes apparent that most of the characters are dead. With only 30 pages left to go, it is suddenly obvious that they are all dead, except for one. But the identity of that single living character is never revealed. The book was not much of a success in Buenos Aires, selling less than 1,000 copies, but thanks to some friends, Rousselot had the pleasure of seeing a well-respected publisher bring out a French edition in 1954. Solitude became Nights on Pampas in the land of Victor Hugo, where it made a little impact, except of two critics, one of whom reviewed it warmly, while the other was perhaps excessively enthusiastic. Then it vanished into the limbo of dusty shelves and overloaded tables in second-hand bookstores. At the end of 1957, however, a film titled Lost Voices was released. It was directed by a Frenchman named Guy Morini, and for anyone who had read Solitude, it was clearly a clever adaptation of Rousselot's book. Morini's film began and ended altogether differently, but its stem or middle section corresponded exactly to the novel. It would be impossible to capture Rousselot's feeling of stunned amazement in the dark, half-empty Buenos Aires cinema, where he first saw the Frenchman's film. Naturally, he considered himself a victim of plagiarism. As the days went by, other explanations occurred to him, but he kept coming back to the idea that his work had been plagiarized. Of the friends who were alerted and went to see the film, half were in favor of suing the production company, while the others were inclined to argue, more or less resignedly, that these things happen. Think of Brahms. By that time, Rousselot had already published a second novel, The Archives of Pierrot Street, a detective story with a plot that revolved around the appearance of three bodies in three different places in Buenos Aires. The first two victims had been killed by the third, victim in turn of an unidentified killer. This second novel was not what might have expected from the author of Solitude. Still, it was well received, although it is perhaps the least successful of Rousselot's works. When Morini's film came out in Buenos Aires, The Archives of Pierrot Street had already been kicking around the city's bookshops for almost a year, and Rousselot had married Maria Eugenia Carrasco, a young woman who moved in the capital's literary circles, and he had recently taken a job with the law firm of Zimmerman and Guruchaga. Rousselot's life was orderly. He got up at 6 in the morning and wrote or tried to write until 8, at which time he interrupted his commerce with the muses, took a shower, and rushed off to the office, where he arrived at around 10 to 9. He spent most mornings in court or going through files. At 2 in the afternoon he returned home, had lunch with his wife, and then went back to the office for the afternoon. At 7 he had a drink with some other lawyers, and by 8 at the latest he was back home, where Miss Rousselot, as she now was, had his dinner ready, after which Rousselot would read, while Maria Eugenia listened to the radio. On Saturdays and Sundays he wrote a bit more, and went out at night without his wife to see his literary friends. The release of Lost Voices brought him an authority that extended in a modest way beyond his circle of associates. His best friend at the law firm, who was not particularly interested in literature, advised him to sue Morini for copyright infringement. Having thought it over carefully, Rousselot decided not to do anything. After The Archives of Pierrot Street, he published a slim volume of stories, and then, almost immediately, his third novel, Life of a Newlywed, in which, as the title suggests, he recounted a man's first months of married life, and how, as the days go by, the man comes to realize that he had made a terrible mistake. Not only is the woman he thought he knew a stranger, she is also a kind of monster who threatens even his physical safety. And yet the guy loves her, or rather discovers that he is physically attracted to her in a way that he wasn't before, so he holds on for as long as he can before fleeing. The book was obviously meant to be humorous, and was embraced by the reading public to the surprise of Rousselot and his publisher. It had to be reprinted after 3 months, and within a year more than 15,000 copies had been sold. From one day to the next, Rousselot's name soared from comfortable semi-obscurity to provisional stardom. He took it in stride. With the windfall earnings, he treated himself, his wife, and his sister-in-law to a vacation in Putna del Este, which he spent surreptitiously reading In Search of Lost Time, a book he had always pretended to have read. While Maria Eugenia and her sister lolled about on the beach, he strove to redeem that lie, but above all to fill the gap left by his ignorance of France's most celebrated novelist. He would have been better off reading the Kabbalists. 7 months after his vacation in Punta del Este, before Life of a Newlywed had even come out in French, Morini's new film, The Shape of the Day, opened in Buenos Aires. It was exactly like Life of a Newlywed, but better. That is, revised and considerably extended in much the same way that Lost Voices had been, compressing Rousselot's plot into the central part of the film, while the beginning and the end served as a commentaries on the main story, or ways into and out of it, or dead ends, or simply, herein lay the charm of this method, delicately filmed scenes from the lives of the minor characters. This time Rousselot was intensely annoyed. His case against Morini was the talk of the Argentine literary world for a week or so, and yet, although everyone presumed that he would take swift legal action, Rousselot decided, to the dismay of those who had expected a stronger and more decisive attitude on his part, to do nothing. Few could really understand his reaction. He did not protest or appeal to the honor and integrity of the artist. After his initial surprise and indignation, Rousselot simply opted not to act. At least not legally. He waited. Something inside him, which could perhaps, without too great a risk of error, be called the writer's spirit, trapped him in a limbo of apparent passivity, and began to harden or change him, or prepare him for future surprises. In other respects, his life as a writer and as a man had already changed as much as he could reasonably have hoped, or more. His books were well reviewed and widely read. They even supplemented his income, and his family life was suddenly enriched by the news that Maria Eugenia was going to be a mother. When Morini's third film came to Buenos Aires, Rousselot stayed home for a week, resisting the temptation to rush to the cinema like a man possessed. He also instructed his friends not to tell him the plot. At first he thought he would not go to see the film, but after a week it was too much for him, and one night, having kissed his baby son and entrusted him to the nanny's care, as if he were going off to war and might never return, he stepped out resignedly, arm in arm with his wife, and went to the cinema. Morini's film was called The Vanished Woman, and had nothing in common with any of Rousselot's works, or with either of Morini's previous films. As they left the cinema, Maria Eugenia said she thought it was bad and boring. Alvaro Rouselott kept his opinion to himself, but he agreed. A few months later, he published his next novel, his longest yet, 206 pages, titled The Jugglers Family, in which he departed from the style that had characterized his work so far, with its elements of fantasy and crime fiction, and experimented with what could at a stretch be called the choral or polyphonic novel. It was a form that didn't come naturally to him and seemed forced, but the book was redeemed by the decency and simplicity of its characters, by a naturalism that elegantly avoided the cliches of the naturalist novel, and by the stories themselves, minimalist and resolute, upbeat and gracious narratives, which captured the indomitable Argentine spirit. The Jugglers Family was without doubt Rousselot's greatest success, the book that brought all the others back into print, and his triumph was consummated by the Municipal Literary Award, presented at a ceremony in the course of which he was described as one of the 5 brightest stars among the nation's younger writers. But that is another story. Everyone knows that the bright rising stars in the literature of any nation are like flowers that bloom and fade in a day, and whether that day is brief and succinct or extends over 10 or 20 years it must eventually come to an end. The French, who distrust our municipal literary words on principle, were slow to translate and publish the Jugglers Family. By then, French fashions in Latin American fiction had shifted to warmer climes than Buenos Aires. When the novel came out in Paris from a different publisher, Morini had already made his fourth and fifth films, a conventional but engaging French detective story and a turkey about a supposedly amusing family vacation in Saint-Tropez. Both films were released in Argentina, and Rousselot was relieved to discover that neither bore a slightest resemblance to anything he had ever written. It was as if Morini had distanced himself from Rousselot, or, under pressure from creditors and swept up in the whirlwind of the movie business, had neglected the relationship. After relief came sadness. For a few days Rousselot was even preoccupied by the thought that he had lost his best reader, the reader from whom he had really been writing, the only one who was truly capable of responding to his work. He tried to get in touch with his translators, but they were busy with other books and other authors, and replied to his letters with polite and evasive phrases. One of them had never seen any of Morini's films. The other had seen only the film that resembled the book he had not translated, or read, to judge from his letter. When Rousselot asked his publishers in Paris if Morini might have had access to the manuscript of Life of a Newlywed before its publication, they weren't even surprised. They replied indifferently that many people had access to a manuscript at various stages prior to printing. Feeling embarrassed, Rousselot decided to stop annoying people with his letters and suspend his investigations until at last he got a chance to visit Paris. A year later, he was invited to a literary festival in Frankfurt. The Argentine delegation was sizable and the trip was pleasant. Rousselot got to know two old Buenos Aires writers whom he considered his masters. He tried to help them in a way he could, offering to render the sorts of little services one might expect from a secretary or a valet rather than a colleague, for which he was reproached by a writer of his own generation who called him obsequious and servile. But Rousselot was happy and paid no attention. The stay in Frankfurt was enjoyable in spite of the weather, and Rousselot spent all his time with the pair of old writers. The slightly artificial atmosphere of happiness was in fact largely Rousselot's own creation. He knew that when the festival was over, he would go on to Paris while the others would return to Buenos Aires or take short vacations somewhere in Europe. When the day of departure came and Rousselot went to the airport to see off the members of the delegation who were returning to Argentina, his eyes filled with tears. One of the old writers noticed and told him not to worry. They would see each other again soon, and the door of his house in Buenos Aires would always be open. But Rousselot couldn't understand what anyone was saying to him. He was on the brink of tears because he was afraid of being left on his own, and afraid, above all, of going to Paris and confronting the mystery waiting for him there. The first thing he did as soon as he had settled into a little hotel in Saint-Germain-les-Prés was to call the translator of Solitude, Nights on the Pampas, unsuccessfully. The phone rang at his apartment, but no one picked up, and when he went to the publisher's offices, they had no idea where the translator might be. To tell the truth, they had no idea who Rousselot was, although he pointed out that they had published two of his books, Nights on the Pampas and Life of a Newlywed. Finally, a guy who must have been about 50 and whose role at the company Rousselot never managed to ascertain, placed the visitor and, changing the topic completely, immediately proceeded to inform him in an absurdly serious tone that the sales of his books had been very poor. Rousselot then visited the publishers of the Jugglers Family, which Morini, it seemed, had never read. and made a half-hearted attempt to obtain the address of the translator they had employed, hoping that he would be able to put him in touch with the translators of Nights on the Pampas and Life of a Newlywed. This second publishing house was significantly smaller and seemed to be run by just two people. A woman who received Rousselot, who he guessed was a secretary, and the publisher, a young guy who greeted him with a smile and a hug, and who insisted on speaking Spanish, although it was soon clear that his grasp of the language was tenuous. When asked why he wanted to speak with the translator of the Jugglers Family, Rousselot was at a loss for words, because it had just dawned on him how absurd it was to think that any of his translators would be able to lead him to Morini. Nevertheless, encouraged by the publisher's warm welcome and his readiness to listen, since he didn't seem to have anything better to do that morning, Rousselot decided to tell him the whole story from A to Z. When he had finished, the publisher lit a cigarette and paced up and down the office for a long time in silence, walking from one wall to the other, a distance of barely 3 yards. Rousselot waited, becoming increasingly nervous. Finally, the publisher stopped in front of a glass-fronted bookcase full of manuscripts and asked Rousselot if it was his first time in Paris. Rather taken aback, Rousselot admitted that it was. "Parisians are cannibals," the publisher said. Rousselot hastened to point out that he was not intending to take any kind of legal action against Morini. He only wanted to meet him and perhaps ask him how he came up with the plots of the two films in which he had a particular interest, so to speak. The publisher burst into uproarious laughter. "It's all about money here," he said, "ever since Camus." Rousselot looked at him bewildered. He didn't know whether the publisher meant that idealism had died with Camus and money was now the prime concern, or that Camus had established the law of supply and demand among artists and intellectuals. "I'm not interested in money," Rousselot said quietly. "Nor am I, my poor friend," the publisher said, "and look where it's got me." They parted with the understanding that Rousselot would call the publisher and arrange to have dinner one night. He spent the rest of the day sightseeing. He went to the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower. He ate in a restaurant in the Latin Quarter and visited a couple of second-hand bookshops. That night, from his hotel, he called an Argentine writer he had known back in Buenos Aires, who lived in Paris now. They weren't exactly friends, but Rousselot appreciated the writer's work and had been instrumental in getting a number of his pieces published in a Buenos Aires magazine. The Argentine writer was called Riquelme, and he was happy to hear from Rousselot. Rousselot wanted to arrange to meet up sometime during this week, perhaps for lunch or dinner, but Riquelme wouldn't hear of it and asked him where he was calling from. Rousselot told him the name of his hotel and mentioned that he was just going to bed, but he was not even to think of getting into his pajamas. Riquelme would be right there. The night was on him. Rousselot was overwhelmed, powerless to resist. He hadn't seen Riquelme for years, and while waiting for him in the lobby of the hotel, he tried to remember what he looked like. He had blonde hair and a round, broad face with a ruddy complexion. He was short. It had been a while since Rousselot had read any of his work. When Riquelme finally appeared, Rousselot hardly recognized him. He seemed taller, less blond, and he was wearing glasses. The night was rich in confessions and revelations. Rousselot told his friend what he had told his French publisher that morning, and Riquelme told Rousselot that he was writing the great Argentine novel of the 20th century. He had passed the 800-page mark and hoped to finish it in less than 3 years. Although Rousselot prudently refrained from asking about plot, Riquelme explained several sections of his book in detail. They visited various bars and clubs. At some point during the night, Rousselot realized that both he and Riquelme were behaving like adolescents. At first this embarrassed him, but then he surrendered to the situation, happy to know that his hotel would be there at the end of the night. His hotel room and the word hotel, which in that instant seemed a miraculous, that is to say, a evanescent incarnation of risk and freedom. He drank a lot. On waking, he discovered a woman beside him. The woman's name was Simone, and she was a prostitute. They had breakfast together in a cafe near the hotel. Simone liked to talk, so Rousselot discovered that she didn't have a pimp, because a pimp was always the worst kind of deal, that she had just turned 28, and that she liked watching movies. Since he wasn't interested in the world of Parisian pimps, and Simone's age didn't seem a fruitful topic of conversation, they started talking about movies. She liked French cinema, and before long they got on to Morini. His first films were very good, in Simone's opinion. Rousselot could have kissed her then and there. At 2 in the afternoon they returned to the hotel and didn't re-emerge until dinner time. It would probably be true to say that Rousselot had never felt so good in his life. He wanted to write and eat and go out dancing with Simone and wander aimlessly through the streets of the left bank. In fact, he felt so good that during the meal, shortly before they ordered dessert, he explained the reason for his trip to Paris. Surprisingly for Rousselot, Simone was not at all surprised by the revelation that he was a writer or that Morini had plagiarized or copied his work, or freely adapted 2 of his novels to make his 2 best films. Things like that happen in life, and even stranger things, was her laconic response. Then, point blank, she asked him if he was married. The answer was implicit in the question, and with a resigned gesture Rousselot showed her the gold ring that was constricting his right finger at that moment as never before. "And do you have children?" Simone asked. "A little boy," Rousselot said, with a tenderness engendered by the mental image of his offspring. And he added, "He looks just like me." Then Simone asked him to keep her company on the way home. In the taxi, neither of them said anything. Both looked out of their windows at the unpredictable spills of bright and dark which make the City of Light seem like a medieval Russian city, or at least like the images of such cities that Soviet directors used to offer for public consumption every now and then in their films. Finally, the taxi pulled up in front of a 4-story building, and Simone invited him to come in. Rousselot wondered whether he should, and then he remembered that he hadn't paid her. Shamefaced, he got out of the taxi without worrying about how he would get back to his hotel. There didn't seem to be many taxis in that neighborhood. Before going into the building, he held out a bunch of uncounted bills, which Simone put into her handbag without counting them either. The building didn't have an elevator. By the time they reached the 4th floor, Rousselot was out of breath. In the dimly lit living room, an old woman was drinking a whitish-colored liquor. In response to a sign from Simone, Rousselot sat down next to the old woman, who produced a glass and filled it with that appalling liquid, while Simone vanished through one of the doors, then reappeared after a while and summoned him with a gesture. What now? Rousselot thought. The room was small. It contained a bed in which a child was sleeping. "My son," Simone said. "He's lovely," Rousselot said. And so he was, but perhaps that was only because he was asleep. He had blonde hair rather too long and resembled his mother, although Rousselot noted that there was already something thoroughly manly about his childish features. When Rousselot went back to the living room, Simone was paying the old woman, who then took her leave of Madame Simone and even wished her visitor an effusive good night, calling him sir. Rousselot was thinking that the day had been eventful enough and that it was time to leave when Simone said he could spend the night with her, if he liked. "But you can't sleep in my bed," she said. She didn't want her son to wake up and see her in bed with a stranger. So they made love in Simon's room, and then Rousselot went out into the living room, lay down on the couch and fell asleep. He spent the next day en famille, so to speak. The little boy's name was Marc. Rousselot found him to be very bright, as well as able to speak better French than he did. The novelist spared no excuse. They had breakfast in the center of Paris, went to a park, and had lunch in a restaurant on the Rue de Verneuil that he had been told about in Buenos Aires. Then they went rowing on a lake, and finally they visited a supermarket where Simone bought all the ingredients for a proper French meal. They took taxis everywhere. As they waited for ice cream on a café terrace on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, Rousselot recognized a pair of famous writers. He admired them from a distance. Simone asked him if he knew them. He said no, but he was a passionate reader of their books. "Then go and ask them for an autograph," she said. At first it seemed a perfectly reasonable idea, the natural thing to do, but at the last minute Rousselot decided that he didn't have the right to annoy anyone, least of all people he had always admired. That night he slept in Simone's bed. They covered each other's mouths to stop their moans from waking the child, and made love for hours, violently at times, as if loving each other were the only thing they knew how to do. The next day he returned to his hotel before the child woke up. His suitcase had not been put on the street, as he had feared, and no one was surprised to see him appear out of nowhere, like a ghost. At reception there were 2 messages from Riquelme. The first was to say he had found out how to reach Morini. The second was to ask if Rousselot was still interested in meeting him. He showered, shaved, brushed his teeth, a horrifying experience, put on clean clothes, and called Riquelme. They talked for a long time. Riquelme told him that a friend of his, a Spanish journalist, knew another journalist, a Frenchman, who was a freelance movie, theater and music critic. The French journalist had been a friend of Morini's and still had his telephone number. When the Spaniard had asked for the number, the Frenchman had given it to him without a second thought. The Riquelme and the Spanish journalist had called Morini's number without getting their hopes up, and were amazed when the woman who answered told them that they had indeed reached the director's residence. Now all they had to do was to set up a meeting at which Riquelme and the Spanish journalist wanted to be present. On some pretext, whatever, for example, an interview for an Argentine newspaper with a surprise ending. "What do you mean a surprise ending?" Rousselot shouted. "The surprise ending comes when the bogus journalist reveals his true identity to the plagiarist," Riquelme replied. That night, as Rousselot was taking photographs more or less at random on the banks of the Seine, a bum came up and asked him for some change. Rousselot offered him a bill if he would consent to be photographed. The bum agreed, and for a while they walked along together in silence, stopping every now and then to allow the Argentine writer to move off to an appropriate distance and take a photo. On the third such occasion the bum suggested a pose, which Rousselot accepted without quibbling. The writer took 8 photos in all, the bum on his knees with his arms stretched out to the sides, and in other poses, such as pretending to sleep on a bench, thoughtfully watching the river flow by, or smiling and waving his hand. When the photo session was over, Rousselot gave him 2 bills and all the coins in his pocket, and then the pair of them stood there together as if there were something more to be said, but neither of them dared to say it. "Where are you from?" the bum asked. "Buenos Aires, Argentina," Rousselot replied. "What a coincidence," the bum said in Spanish. "I'm Argentine too." Rousselot was not at all surprised by this revelation. The bum began to hum a tango, and then told him that in Europe, where he'd been living for more than 15 years, he had found happiness and even some wisdom now and then. Rousselot realized that the bum had started using familiar form of address, which he hadn't done when they were speaking in French. Even his voice, the tone of his voice, seemed to have changed. Rousselot felt a deep sadness overwhelming him, as if he knew that, come the end of the day, he would have to look into an abyss. The bum noticed and asked him what he was worried about. "Nothing, a girl," Rousselot said, trying to adopt the same tone as his compatriot. Then he said a rather hurried goodbye, and as he was climbing the stairs from the quay to the street, he heard the bum's voice telling him that death was the only sure thing. "My name is Enzo Cherubini, and I'm telling you that death is the only sure thing there is." When Rousselot turned around, the bum was walking off in the opposite direction. He called Simone that night, but she wasn't home. He talked for a while with the old woman who looked after the child, then hung up. At 10, Riquelme came visiting. Reluctant to go out, Rousselot said he felt feverish and nauseated, but his excuses were futile. Sadly, he came to the realization that Paris had transformed his friend into a force of nature that would brook no opposition. That night they dined in a little restaurant with a charcoal grill in the Rue Racine, where they were joined by the Spanish journalist Paco Moral, who liked to imitate the Buenos Aires accent very badly and believed that Spanish cinema was far better than French cinema, much more dense, an opinion shared by Riquelme. The meal went on much longer than anticipated, and Rousselot began to feel ill. When he returned to his hotel at 4 in the morning, he had a fever and began vomiting. He woke shortly before midday with the feeling that he had lived in Paris for many years. He went through the pockets of his jacket, looking for the cell phone that he had managed to extract from Riquelme, and called Morini. A woman, the one who had previously spoken to Riquelme, he supposed, answered and told him that Mr. Morini has left that morning to spend a few days with his parents. Rousselot's first thought was that she was lying, or that before his hurried departure the director has lied to her. He said he was an Argentinian journalist who wanted to interview Morini for a well-known magazine with a big circulation, widely read all over Latin America, from Argentina to Mexico. The only problem, he alleged, was that he had limited time, since he had to fly home in a couple of days. Humbly he asked for the address of Morini's parents. He didn't have to insist. The woman listened politely, then gave him the name of a village in Normandy, a street and a number. Rousselot thanked her, then called Simone. No one was home. Suddenly he realized that he didn't even know what day it was. He thought of asking one of the hotel staff, but felt embarrassed. He called Riquelme. A hoarse voice answered. Rousselot asked him about the village where Morini's parents lived. Did he know where it was? "Who's Morini?" Riquelme asked. Rousselot had to remind him and explain part of the story again. "No idea," Riquelme said, and hung up. After feeling annoyed for a while, Rousselot told himself that it was better that way, if Riquelme had lost interest in the whole business. Then he packed his suitcases and went to the train station. The trip to Normandy was long enough for him to go back over what he had done since arriving in Paris. An absolute zero lit up in his mind, then delicately disappeared forever. The train stopped in Rouen. Other Argentines, and Rousselot himself in other circumstances, would have set off at once to explore the town, like bloodhounds on Flaubert's trail. But he didn't even leave the station. He waited 20 minutes for the train to come, thinking of Simone, who personified the grace of French women, and of Riquelme and his old journalist friend, both of whom were, in the end, more interested in rummaging through their own failures than in anyone else's story, however singular, which, come to think of it, was not so unusual, normal in fact. People are only interested in themselves, he concluded gravely. From Cannes he took a taxi to Le Hamel. He was surprised to find that the address he had been given in Paris corresponded to a hotel. The hotel had 4 stories and was not without a certain charm, but it was closed for the winter. For half an hour Rousselot walked around in the vicinity, wondering if the woman who lived with Morini had sent him on a wild goose chase, until eventually he began to feel tired and headed for the port. In a bar he was told that he'd be very lucky to find a hotel in Le Hamel, and the owner, a cadaverously pale guy with red hair, suggested he go to Argentinian unless he wanted to sleep in one of the auberges that stayed open all year around. Rousselot thanked him and went looking for a taxi. He booked himself into the best hotel he could find, in Argentinian, a pile made of brick, stone and wood which creaked in a gusting wind. Tonight I will dream of Proust, he thought. Then he called Simone and talked to the old lady who looked after her child. Madame won't be home until after 4. She has an orgy tonight, the woman said. A what? Rousselot asked. The woman repeated the sentence. My God, Rousselot thought, and hung up without saying goodbye. To make things worse, that night he didn't dream of Proust but of Buenos Aires, where thousands of Riquelmes had taken up residence in the Argentine branch of Penn, and all armed with tickets to Paris, all cursing or shouting a name, the name of someone or something that Rousselot couldn't recognize, a tongue twister, perhaps, or a password they were trying to keep secret, although it was gnawing at their insides. The next morning at breakfast, Rousselot was stunned to discover that he had no money left. Le Hamel was 3 or 4 kilometers from Argentinian. He decided to walk. To raise his spirits, he told himself that on D-Day the Allied soldiers had landed on these beaches, but his spirits remained as low as could be, and although he had thought it might take half an hour, in the end it took him more than twice that time to reach Le Hamel. On the way, he started adding things up, remembering how much money he had brought with him to Europe, how much he had left when he arrived in Paris, how much he had spent on meals, on Simone, quite a lot, he thought melancholically, on Riquelme, on taxis. They've been ripping me off the whole time, and wondering whether he could have been robbed at some point without realizing it. The only people who could have done that, he concluded gallantly, were the Spanish journalist and Riquelme, and the idea didn't seem absurd in those surroundings, where so many lives had been lost. He observed Morini's hotel from the beach. Anyone else would have given up by now, he thought. For anyone else, circling around that hotel would have been as good as admitting to idiocy, or to a sort of degeneration that Rousselot thought of as Parisian, or cinematic, or even literary, although for him the word literary retained all its original luster, or some of it at least. In his situation, anyone else would have been calling the Argentine embassy, inventing a credible lie, and borrowing some money to pay the hotel bill, but instead of gritting his teeth and making the phone call, Rousselot rang the hotel's doorbell, and was not surprised to hear the voice of an old woman, who, leaning out of one of the windows on the 2nd floor, asked him what he wanted, and was not surprised by his reply. I need to see your son. The old woman disappeared, and Rousselot waited by the door for what seemed like an eternity. He kept checking his pulse and touching his forehead to see if he had a fever. When the door finally opened, he saw a lean, rather swarthy face with large bags under the eyes. It was, he judged, the face of a degenerate, and it was vaguely familiar. Morini invited him in. My parents have been working as caretakers of this hotel for more than 30 years, he said. They sat down in the lobby, where the armchairs were protected from dust by enormous sheets embroidered with the hotel's monogram. On the wall, Rousselot saw an oil painting of the beaches of Le Hamel, with bathers in Belle Époque costumes, and on the opposite wall a collection of portraits of famous clients, or so he supposed, observed them from a zone taken over by mist. He shivered. "I am Alvaro Rouselott," he said, "the author of Solitude. I mean the author of Nights on the Pampas." It took a few seconds for Morini to react, but then he leaped to his feet, let out a cry of terror, and disappeared down a corridor. Such a spectacular response was the last thing Rousselot had been expecting. His reaction was to remain seated, light a cigarette, the ash fell steadily on the carpet, and think moodily of Simone and her son, and a cafe in Paris that served the best croissants he had ever tasted. Then he stood up and started calling Morini. "Guy," he called rather hesitantly. "Guy, Guy, Guy." Rousselot found Morini in an attic where the hotel's cleaning equipment was piled. He had opened the window and seemed to be hypnotized by the garden that surrounded the building, and by the neighboring garden which belonged to a private house and was visible in part through dark lattice work. Rousselot walked over and patted him on the back. Morini seemed smaller and more fragile than before. For a while they both stood there looking at one garden, then the other. Then Rousselot wrote the address of his hotel in Paris and the address of the hotel where he was currently staying on a piece of paper and slipped it into the director's trouser pocket. He felt as if he had committed a reprehensible act, executed a reprehensible gesture, but then, as he was walking back to Aramosh, everything he had done in Paris, every gesture and action, seemed reprehensible, futile, senseless, and even ridiculous. "I should kill myself," he thought, as he walked along the seashore. Back in Aramosh, he did what any reasonable person would have done as soon as he discovered that his money had run out. He called Simone, explained the situation, and asked her for a loan. The first thing Simone said was that she didn't want a pimp, to which Rousselot replied that he was asking for a loan and that he was planning to repay it with 30% interest, but then they both started laughing and Simone told him not to do anything, just stay put in the hotel, and in a few hours, as soon as she could borrow a car from one of her friends, she'd come and get him. She also called him chéri a few times, to which he responded by using the word chéri, which had never seemed so tender. For the rest of the day, Rousselot felt that he really was an Argentine writer, something he had begun to doubt over the previous days, or perhaps the previous years, partly because he was unsure of himself, but also because he was unsure about the possibility of an Argentine literature.